What genre is Doom? You know, the original one from 1993. I know what you're thinking. It's a stupid question. It's an FPS. It's the definitive FPS. And it's a fair point. Doom ticks all the boxes required for any reasonable definition of a first-person shooter. It's presented from a first-person perspective, and shooting the bad guys is a key part of it. But the FPS genre didn't exist when Doom released. The term first-person shooter wasn't common until a few years later. So, what genre was Doom? How was it originally described? In the original advertising and the manual for the first commercial release, it's described as a lightning-fast virtual reality adventure, which is a spectacularly poor description of the game. It's clearly not an adventure game, nor would it be described as virtual reality by today's standards. However, in the early 90s, virtual reality was used as a byword for 3D graphics, anything from a first-person perspective, and this was one of the defining features of Doom. Computer Gaming World described it as an action game with a first-person 3D environment, then later classified the wave of imitators as 3D first-person action games. Doom's fast-paced action was essential to its early description. Parallels were drawn with the existing shoot-'em-up genre. A preview in 3DO magazine described it as a first-person perspective blaster, and a review in 64 magazine used the very nearly contemporary term first-person shoot-'em-up. What surprised me was just how few attempts there were to actually categorize Doom. Its emergence was so explosive, and its appeal so widespread, there wasn't a need to pigeonhole it. Doom was Doom, a genre unto itself. The trouble is, every single first-person shooter released between 1994 and 1996 was viewed only through the lens of Doom. For a while, it was the standard reference to the emerging genre. If it looked like Doom and played like Doom, it was a Doom clone. This was sometimes used in a slightly derisory way, as in just another Doom clone, but there was no shortage of imitators. Heretic was a Doom clone. Dark Forces was a Doom clone. Duke Nukem 3D was a Doom clone. But there's a bit of a problem in describing broad categories of games with the name of another. If Doom clone is the genre, what does that make Doom? Is Doom a Doom clone? Is Rogue a roguelike? It seems ridiculous to invent a new genre centered on a single game, only to then exclude the originator. But it's dafter still to think of Doom as a Doom clone. Luckily, the use of Doom clone was short-lived. After a while, the genre matured, imitators became innovators, and the label was re-examined. We'd know them as first-person shooters eventually, of course, but it took longer than you might think. As early as 1994, Aliens vs. Predator was called a first-person perspective shoot-'em-up. Zero Tolerance for the Mega Drive was described the same way. Slightly long-winded, but all the right elements are there. The US edition of PC Gamer were slightly ahead of the curve, as they seem to have settled on first-person shooter as the definitive nomenclature since as early as 1995. However, it would be some time yet before a common consensus was reached. Just as Doom clones were becoming old hat, Quake came along. It would be disrespectful to describe Quake as a mere Doom clone. So what happened? The reference shifted. Hot new FPS games were instead billed as Quake killers. Half-Life was a Quake killer. Unreal was a Quake killer. Daikatana was a Quake killer. But there was still no consensus on what the genre should be called. When these early FPS games were described without a reference to Doom or Quake, we can see a whole variety of terms. One reasonably popular phrase was 3D shoot 'em up, which saw increased use after the release of Quake in 1996. Shoot 'em up was shortened to shooter in some instances too. After Half-Life's release in 1998, we can start to see the terminology coalesce. Although first-person shoot 'em up was used as late as mid-1999, by the end of the year, first-person shooter had become the de facto term for the genre. So that's 6 years between the release of Doom and the widespread adoption of first-person shooter as the universal term. And it would take another year or so before the abbreviation FPS became common. To summarize, Doom was unlike anything else, inspired a whole wave of imitators, and Doom and its later ilk were retroactively filed under first-person shooters. So here's a hypothetical question. What if Doom wasn't a huge success? What if there was no explosion of FPS games and the genre wasn't established in the same way? Solely in the context of things that came before, how would we categorize Doom? The closest ancestor to Doom is its own Wolfenstein 3D, a 3D reimagining of 1981's Castle Wolfenstein, and a bona fide FPS by modern standards. Reviews at the time described it as an arcade shoot-'em-up, with multiple comparisons to Ultima Underworld, a first-person RPG released the same year. Perhaps more interesting is id's earlier Catacomb 3D, a fantasy-themed 3D shooter, even more primitive than Wolfenstein 3D, but definitely part of the same lineage. Catacomb 3D was a sequel to two earlier Catacomb games, a transposition of their top-down gameplay to a first-person perspective. The original Catacomb was essentially a Gauntlet clone, a top-down dungeon crawl, slaying monsters and hunting for keys to open doors and reach the level exit. In a broad sense, the core gameplay loop of Gauntlet is almost identical to Doom. If you make Gauntlet with a first-person perspective and change the setting slightly, you would have a game that was very similar to Doom. Which is strange, because Gauntlet is almost certainly an RPG. Shooters were a relatively late arrival to the world of first-person perspective games. First-person RPGs were commonplace by the arrival of Dungeon Master in 1987. Of course, first-person doesn't mean true 3D. Dungeon Master was presented in orthogonal pseudo 3D. Movement was stepped, and you could only look in each of the 4 cardinal directions. One problem with a first-person perspective is that you can't see your characters. Dungeon Master's solution was to show a small character portrait for each of your party members, and this became a standard for later first-person dungeon crawlers, such as Eye of the Beholder. This may explain why Catacomb 3D, Wolfenstein 3D, and Doom all have a character portrait. The grid-based movement and rotation of the Dungeon Master clones was a result of technical limitation, and never seen as ideal. So, as soon as computers became powerful enough, RPGs moved to a 3D view instead. One of the earliest textured 3D RPGs is Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss. Released nearly 2 years ahead of Doom and heralded as a milestone for RPGs. It's also part of the reason that Doom is texture mapped. In 1991, John Romero was talking to one of the developers of Ultima Underworld and discovered that they were working on a texture mapped 3D game. He spoke to John Carmack on the technical feasibility, and Catacomb 3D was the result. Underworld was fairly influential, marking the emergence of first-person, texture-mapped 3D RPGs. The likes of Ravenloft, Legends of Valor, and Betrayal at Krondor followed. Bethesda Softworks are of course known for such RPGs today, but they built their original reputation with Wayne Gretzky Hockey. In 1990, they struck a deal to produce games with the Terminator license, the first of which was The Terminator. It's an interesting game, essentially a primitive Grand Theft Auto with polygonal graphics. The Terminator Rampage released in 1993 and drew immediate comparison with Wolfenstein 3D. Unfortunately, the comparisons are generally unfavorable, and worse still, the game released at the same time as Doom. Still, Bethesda had a 3D engine and, inspired by Ultima Underworld, decided to make their own 3D RPG. The Elder Scrolls Arena wasn't an immediate success, but it did eventually gain a cult following. It was successful enough to warrant a sequel in Daggerfall, and of course the Elder Scrolls series remains incredibly popular today. Then there's Shadowcaster, described as a crossbreed of Doom, Dungeon Master, and Ultima Underworld. It was based on an enhanced version of the Wolfenstein 3D engine, with full texture mapping, lighting, variable height walls, and slopes. It's an interesting evolutionary step between Wolfenstein and Doom, and while it was action-led, it is technically an RPG. Later came Heretic, developed by the same team who made Shadowcaster, except this time with the Doom engine. Were it released earlier, no doubt it would have been described as an RPG, but with a close resemblance to Doom, it was tarred with the Doom clone moniker instead. Strife in 1996 used the Doom engine, but added definitive RPG elements, player stats, dialogue. Of course, it couldn't hide from the comparison, being described as a different kind of Doom. By this point, the Doom engine was some distance from state-of-the-art. Quake's release was imminent. But Strife demonstrated the potential marriage of first-person shooters and RPGs, and that the difference isn't insurmountably vast. So, Doom has the core gameplay loop of Gauntlet, the first-person perspective and character portrait of Dungeon Master, direct influence from both Ultima Underworld and Dungeons & Dragons, and it neatly nestles amongst contemporary 3D RPGs such as Elder Scrolls Arena, System Shock, and Shadowcaster. Clearly, Doom is an action RPG. Sure, it deviated a little from the usual fantasy setting, but there's no rule against that. Compare the 1993 game Hired Guns. Clearly an RPG of the Dungeon Master lineage, but with a futuristic setting and a whole load of guns. Doom is essentially the same, save for a single character and a more fluid first-person perspective. Doom has auto-mapping, health potions, keys to unlock doors, different armor classes, and a whole range of magical power-ups. Doom is an action RPG. Thank you. I will be taking no questions. Thanks for watching. Until next time, farewell.